I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Hughes for everyone who's following this. As I said, Mrs. Susie Hughes is the director of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China and calling all the way from Australia. Mrs. Hughes.
Thank you very much. It's an honour to speak before you today about this pressing issue, so I really appreciate your time. For at least 2 decades, the government of China has been accused of forcibly harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience, killing the victim in the process. Although multiple reports from credible sources have demonstrated evidence of forced organ harvesting since 2006, controversy has persisted. This has been partly due to the readiness of some governments and international transplant organisations to accept the Chinese government's reform narrative, despite a continued lack of transparency that breaches the international standards promoted by these same organisations. Our organisation, the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, or ETAC, decided to approach distinguished barrister and expert in crimes of mass atrocity, Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, for an independent legal opinion. When we first approached Sir Geoffrey, he recommended that the gravity of the allegations justified a People's Tribunal. However, of course, there was no guarantee for us that the outcome would result in mass crimes being committed. For us, primarily a coalition of lawyers, academics, medical professionals and researchers, it was worth what could be perceived as a risk. It was vitally important to progress this debate about whether China has been killing innocent people for their organs or not. Although the China Tribunal was initiated by ETAC, there was a necessary separation between ETAC and the Tribunal. ETAC was at no stage privy to the Tribunal's deliberations, and counsel to the Tribunal, Mr. Hamid Sabi, acted as a shield between ETAC and the Tribunal. All evidence submitted was via the Tribunal Council. Specifically, the Tribunal's mandate was to hear and assess evidence to determine whether forced organ harvesting is occurring in China, and if so, what, if any, international crimes have been committed. So where does the evidence begin? Prior to 2000, there were few transplants in China, with numbers gradually increasing following advances in immunotherapy. During this period, organs were primarily sourced from death row prisoners. However, an investigation by Human Rights Watch in 1994 reported that other non-violent criminals and political prisoners were also drawn into the organ pool during that time. That Chinese doctors participated in pre-execution medical tests and matching of prisoners with recipients, often on a first paid, first served basis, and that the executions were deliberately mishandled to ensure that prisoners were not yet dead when their organs were removed. From 2000, there was a rapid increase in the number of transplants. The source of the organs underpinning this high level of activity has never been explained in a credible way by the Chinese government, with the number of transplants taking place far exceeding the number of death row prisoners executed. Of great concern, the increase in transplant activity coincided with the repression and mass arrest of practitioners of the Buddhist Qigong practice of Falun Gong during the 2000s. So broadly speaking, the lines of evidence examined by the China Tribunal include, but are not limited to, the following. Evidence of medical testing that includes organ scanning, CT scans, X-rays and ultrasounds, primarily of Falun Gong practitioners in custody, but also more recently of the Uyghur people. Investigations analysing information from official Chinese websites such as bed utilisation rates, hospital revenue and transplant infrastructure, which indicates China is conducting far more transplant operations than their official claims. Undercover investigations conducted in Chinese hospitals that show transplant tourism is taking place and organs are available on demand. More technical medical evidence indicating that a so-called donor was killed rather than died of natural causes. Involvement of the military in transplant activity and research, websites where hospitals advertise transplant services to foreigners on a pre-scheduled basis, including for heart transplants, telephone investigations to Chinese transplant specialists confirming waiting times are as short as 2 weeks, with some calls stating that Falun Gong organs are available. In one forensically examined phone call, the former PLA Minister for Health, Bai Shuzhong, stated that ex-President Jiang Zemin directly ordered the killing of Falun Gong practitioners for their organs. And a statistical analysis that shows current official Chinese organ donation data has been manipulated and does not represent the real numbers. You're most likely aware that the China Tribunal concluded in part that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale. Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And the vulnerability of the Uyghurs to being used as a bank of organs is also obvious. One request that we've had a number of times post the tribunal judgment is to point out what evidence there is that forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience continues today. The most recent evidence reviewed by the China Tribunal can be found in the telephone calls of 2018, a Korean investigation of 2017, and testimonies from Uyghurs who have been subjected to forced organ scans in detention as recent as 2018. The falsified organ donation numbers from China also add to this current evidence picture. Post-tribunal evidence continues to emerge. However, some of it is not publicly accessible due to the need to protect witnesses. This includes numerous testimonies from Uyghurs and Kazakhs who have now escaped detention camps in Xinjiang in which they were subjected to forced CT scans, ultrasound, blood tests and DNA testing. Organs continuing to be available on demand, phone calls to hospitals in 2019, which are currently being translated from Chinese, indicate extremely short waiting times for organs in a matter of weeks. We have a summary document that we can forward. Undercover video footage from 2019 of a Chinese surgeon stating that a liver transplantation could be arranged within 2 to 3 weeks. A 2019 video of a transplant recipient in a Chinese hospital speaking with an undercover investigator posing as a patient in need of a transplant. The recipient recommends trying to get a Qigong organ because the Qigong exercises increase oxygen in the organs and therefore the organs are very good and last a long time. Based on the China Tribunal's judgment and post-tribunal evidence, the most ethical response is to act on the basis that abuses are ongoing until such a time as we can be sure that they have ceased. We have no confidence that forced organ harvesting has ceased until there is accountability and transparency in China's organ transplantation system. In summary, the overall value of the collective body of evidence is greater than the mere sum of its parts. Individual lines of evidence, when brought together, paint a backdrop of planned, systematic, institutional and intentional organ harvesting. So what can and must be done? Legislation needs to be put in place banning organ trafficking and transplant tourism with a component for mandatory reporting to ensure transplant tourism is tracked. Universities and hospitals should abide by their business and human rights obligations. Partnerships with China in relation to transplant medicine, research and training are increasing. Policy is urgently needed so that collaborations do not take place in relation to organ transplantation. Any institutions already collaborating should disassociate immediately. Chinese transplant surgeons should not be allowed to participate in international transplant conferences, nor should they be allowed to partake on decision-making groups within leading international bodies such as the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group, the Transplantation Society, or the WHO, where they currently have representation. Resolutions should be passed by governments around the world condemning forced organ harvesting in China, urging both international bodies and the public to act. Chinese perpetrators should be sanctioned. Governments should request answers from the WHO on their current position that China's current transplant system is ethical. Considering that it was revealed in a recent debate in the UK House of Lords that the evidence the WHO bases their advice on is provided by the Chinese authorities themselves. And also to question the WHO on the funding sources coming from China for the WHO task force. UN member states should abide by the legal obligations of the treaties they have signed, including under the Genocide Convention and the Convention Against Torture. They should uphold their obligations under the UN responsibility to protect. And they could also seek a formal legal opinion from the International Court of Justice. So these are only some of the actions that need to take place to prevent others from being entangled in China's transplant crimes, to protect those who are still at risk, to bring recognition, solace and hope to the victims and members of the victimised and targeted groups, so primarily the Falun Gong practitioner community and now the Uyghurs, and ultimately to bring justice to those whose lives have been lost. So thank you very much for your attention and for the time to speak today.
thank you very much, Mrs. Hughes, for this very clear introduction. Also, you've given points what has to be done, and that's also very interesting, I think, for us as parliamentarians. So thank you very much.